This soldier fought on Hamburger Hill and he's not even American. Have you ever wondered what it was like to fight on Hamburger Hill? Well, join me as I share the story of a soldier who witnessed the brutal reality of this infamous battle. This is the story of Private First Class Ernest Frageman. He saw things that no one should ever see, like the body of a young Marine who had both of his legs blown off by a tank round. He was a medic in the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, and he treated everyone, no matter if they were American or not. Frageman was at the scene of Hamburger Hill when the Marines took heavy casualties. He suffered from anxiety and night terrors, and he couldn't even listen to music without having a panic attack. Despite the horrific conditions, Frageman and his fellow Marines held their ground and eventually the enemy retreated. But the battle took a toll on him. When he finally returned home, he was unable to readjust to civilian life. He became homeless and addicted to drugs. This is the real story of the forgotten soldiers who fought on Hamburger Hill. They say only to certainties in life, death, and taxes. But if you were to ask any combat veteran, they'll tell you there's a third certainty as well: suffering. Suffering is inevitable in war. And if you ever doubt their veracity, all you need to do is look at the history books, or better yet, ask a veteran yourself. Its military significance was simple. From its peak, one could see for miles around. In the right hands, it was an ideal defensive position and a great vantage point to direct artillery fire. The following year, President Nixon's policy of Vietnamization was in full swing, whereby U.S. troops were gradually withdrawn from the front lines in favor of their South Vietnamese counterparts. On April, they overran a key Special Forces camp at AP Bac, killing almost everyone inside. Only 10 survived the attack, which became known as the AP Bac Massacre. In response, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division was sent in to retake the town. A company of South Vietnamese paratroopers was also deployed to the area to cut off any NVA escape routes. He also reported that the hill was covered in tripwires, punji pits, and mines. Before anyone could respond, though, contact was lost. The men on the ground were in danger. They needed help fast. By 4:30 p.m., the Americans had reached the base of the hill. Here they came under fire from automatic weapons and recoilless rifles. In minutes, the hill changed hands and the NVA were in full retreat. The Americans suffered 57 casualties in the attack. Of those, 42 were carried off the hill on stretchers, but this far from ended the battle. The hill was defended by just 40 men led by a young NVA lieutenant. But despite their small numbers, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans. While the hill was now in friendly hands, the men who captured it were too depleted to hold it. Accordingly, the 3rd Brigade withdrew from AP Bac and Hamburger Hill on May. The Americans were gone and the NVA returned to the town, leaving behind another 150 dead. Again and again, they attacked, and again, they were repelled. All told, there were 13 such assaults. The NVA had suffered enough and retreated into the hills. The Americans were exhausted but victorious. They had paid dearly for their success, however. At least 500 had been wounded, 23 killed, and 10 were missing in action. The NVA dead lay strewn across the hill, perhaps 300 in all. The last came at 3 o'clock in the morning when 150 NVA soldiers charged up the hill. They got within 10 meters of the American lines before they were cut down. In time, the jungle grew over the hill again, but the memory of the battle remained. Today, Hamburger Hill is remembered as a symbol of the brutality of the Vietnam War, a conflict in which both sides suffered tremendous losses for very little gain. So on May, the 3rd Brigade was reinforced by elements of the 1st Brigade and the 4th Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The 4th was tasked with capturing Hamburger Hill. Their orders were to destroy the enemy and clear the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Tasked with the difficult assignment was the 3rd Brigade, nicknamed the Buffaloes. Worse still, the South Vietnamese paratroopers had been pushed back by NVA sappers who had managed to infiltrate their positions unnoticed. But the NVA were ready for them. For 3 days, the Americans fought to clear the town, but they were unable to dislodge the NVA defenders. Outside, the 21st had suffered 173 casualties. Inside AP back, the Americans had been forced to abandon their vehicles and fight on foot. One platoon even traded places with the NVA when they ran out of ammunition and had to retreat through enemy lines to friendly territory. Now trapped on a knife edge, the Americans dug in and waited for the promised reinforcements. By May, there were about 260,000 Americans still in country, along with 150,000 South Vietnamese. 3 hours later, they reached the bottom of the hill, where they came under fire from the NVA. Fighting through thick bush, the Americans spread out in a wide arc around the base of the hill. Reaching the summit was proving difficult. Then one soldier spotted a break in the foliage. He yelled out and the others followed him. One by one, they slipped through the trees until suddenly they were in the open at the top of Hamburger Hill. They soon ran into trouble when elements of the 7th NVA Regiment, 4th Battalion ambushed the companies of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, forcing them to withdraw. To protect the Americans while reinforcements were brought up, the South Vietnamese 21st Infantry Battalion moved into the town, but they too came under attack, and by nightfall, the 21st had suffered 50% casualties and the Americans 15. With the situation looking grim, Major General Samuel W. Coster, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, ordered the Buffaloes to hold their positions and await relief the next day. The plan was to train and equip the ARVN to take over for the Americans entirely. But as it turned out, the South Vietnamese weren't ready to bear the full burden of fighting the war. These factors made it a key part of the defense of Apok, which in turn was an important part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vast network of supply routes that snaked through southern Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The trail was critical to the NVA's war effort since most of its supplies had to be transported overland from its base in North Vietnam due to the strong American naval blockade of the coastline. Reconnaissance by American aircraft revealed hundreds of NVA soldiers and several anti-aircraft guns on the hill. The general knew he needed artillery support to dislodge them, but first he needed to keep them in place. His eyes turned to Hamburger Hill. It was empty, undefended, and perfect for setting up a forward observation post. If established, this would allow the Americans to direct their artillery without fear of the shots being wasted on friendly troops. As such, capturing Apok and with it Hamburger Hill would deal a significant blow to the NVA's ability to wage war. Such was the case with Hamburger Hill. For 3 days from May to May 1969, that battle was a hard-fought, bloody affair, and so too would be the Battle of Hamburger Hill. American and South Vietnamese forces fought tooth and nail against the North Vietnamese army to capture a small hill near the town of AP Bac in the southern province of Bin Long. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War and an object lesson in the brutal reality of war where victory comes at a terrible cost. So what happened at Hamburger Hill? Why did the Americans fight so hard to capture it? And why was it such a costly engagement? This is Sandbox News. Hamburger Hill was a 100-meter high hill south of the town of AP Bac overlooking the surrounding area. But the hill also had another name among American troops, a shaggy ridge, a nickname taken from the famous Battle of World War II between the Australians and Japanese on the similarly named hill in Papua New Guinea. By the end of 1968, the U.S. had committed more than 500,000 troops to fight in Vietnam. In April, the NVA launched the Easter Offensive, a series of attacks across the country aimed at showing the world that the South Vietnamese could defend themselves. On May, the 3rd Brigade advanced towards AP Bac. Meanwhile, the NVA dug in around Hamburger Hill, a perfect defensive position with plenty of cover and concealment. On May, 3 platoons from Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry set out to seize the hill. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Lampert radioed headquarters that his men were pinned down and requested air support, but it wasn't forthcoming. The American helicopter gunships had been delayed by bad weather. Throughout the night, heavy fighting continued around Apok. At dawn, the Buffaloes renewed their assault on the town, relieving pressure on Hamburger Hill. It became clear to the generals that they would have to bring in more troops to finish the job. At noon, the men began their long trek to the top. What followed was pure carnage. The envy kept coming back in larger and larger numbers, trying to recapture their lost position. When the sun rose the next morning, the fighting on Hamburger Hill had stopped. Despite their victory, the generals knew the cost of Hamburger Hill might not be worth it. After the battle, Hamburger Hill was abandoned, the bodies buried, and the wounded treated. This is a story from the Vietnam War. It's about a young soldier who didn't want to go to Vietnam but did anyway. And it's about how he coped with everything that was happening around him. The soldier is someone I knew, and I talked to him recently. He told me this story. It's his story. Here it goes. I was actually pretty excited. I said to myself, finally, it's my turn. I got to do something important. I also believed in the cause. I truly thought we were going to make the world a better place by going to Vietnam. Basic training was hard, but I made it through. When the first arrived in Vietnam, I was stationed at a base near Saigon. My job was to teach new recruits. I spent 3 months doing that. But then I asked to get out of the classroom and go on a combat assault. He told me that I wasn't allowed to leave the base without him knowing about it. The Viet Cong attacked every major city in South Vietnam. That's when I saw that this war wasn't about bravery or glory. It was about death. It was about killing. I was only 20 years old. Some people smoke dope. Some people just push it all away and pretend it never happened. But I couldn't do that. I was too young when I went to Vietnam. I was too old when I got back. I've spent most of my life trying to make sense of what I saw. Most days I still can't. I'd gone from being excited about being in the military to hating everything about it. I hated the heat, the humidity, the constant fighting, the leeches, the snakes, the bugs, the people, the stench of death, the smell of the jungle, the monsoon rains, the mountains, the valleys, the whole damn country. For 3 days, we fought nonstop. We were defending an airfield outside of Saigon. When the attack was over, we went out to see what happened. We saw thousands of dead bodies lying around. It was horrible. We found bunkers filled with dead VC soldiers, entire families massacred. There were women and children lying next to each other, dead. We found hospitals where doctors, nurses, and patients were killed. It was horrible. It broke my heart. I told him I didn't realize that's what I was doing. He just shook his head and walked away. After he left, I thought to myself, I'm going crazy. This isn't right. I couldn't believe that I was getting yelled at for falling asleep in the jungle. I'd seen enough movies to know that if I was in the jungle and I fell asleep, I wouldn't wake up. I wanted to see what it was like. 3 weeks later, I was on my first mission. By the time I finished, I was one of the drill sergeants. They let me stay on as an instructor, but after 3 months, I missed my girlfriend too much. I was so happy that I could have cried. I hugged my sergeant. I shook the captain's hand. I said goodbye to the guys in my platoon, and then I got on the plane. When I got back to the States, I tried to get back to normal life. I went back to school and got a degree in history. I married the girl I was in love with when I went into the service. We had kids. I had a good job, but something was missing. I could never shake the feeling that I'd lost a part of myself somewhere in the jungle. And I wanted to get out, so I volunteered to go to Vietnam. My plan was to get it over and done with. I wanted to see what it was all about. I told my mother that I was proud to be going to Vietnam. She cried. My dad just nodded his head. He already knew that I was going. To me, it was an adventure. I was gonna do what my dad did. I was gonna be a hero. I grew up in northern New Jersey, very close to New York City. When I got there, I felt guilty for being happy. I mean, here I was, some kid from New Jersey, making jokes about everything around me. I hadn't seen anything yet. I was green. I hadn't seen combat. All I'd seen so far was the base, but the other soldiers, they'd been there for months. Some of them for years, and they were all tired of it. I could tell even though they put on a brave face. I could tell because I was the new guy, they knew I'd ask questions. So they felt compelled to put on a good show for me. But it didn't take long before they started telling me the truth. My father was born in Italy and my mother was born in the United States. I found myself alone in the middle of the jungle. I was scared. I really scared. But then I realized I wasn't carrying my weapon. It was back at the base, so I wasn't really in danger. Still, I was pissed off. I remember thinking, if I ever get out of this, I'm getting the hell out of the army. Then I started to laugh. It was the only thing I could do. I started laughing and I kept laughing. I laughed so hard that I cried. And then I cried so hard that I fell asleep. When I woke up, I was back at the base. One of the guys from my platoon found me and brought me back. He didn't know that I'd left. He assumed that I was on drugs. I told him what happened and he just shook his head and smiled. He said, "Welcome to Vietnam." I remember sitting at the kitchen table listening to his stories. Even though I was very young, I could tell that my dad never really got over what he experienced during the war. In fact, I don't think any of us ever do. I heard enough of those stories that I knew that if I got drafted, I would try and get overseas. I wanted to see what was going on for myself. I was drafted into the army when I was 19 years old. At the time, there were protests all over the country about the Vietnam War. There was no question about it. If you were a young man at the time, you expected to get drafted. We all knew that we were heading into something. My dad had been in World War II. When he came back, he always spoke about his experiences in Europe. That's what sparked my interest in history. In high school, I read all about the major conflicts throughout history, so when I got drafted, I wasn't scared. When I got my notice that I'd been drafted, I was working as a butcher. I went to the draft office to find out when I'd have to report for duty. The guy behind the desk looked up and saw that I was shaking. He asked me if I was okay. I told him, "I'm not okay, I'm going to Vietnam." He just smiled and said, "Hey, calm down, you're not going anywhere for 6 months. You've got plenty of time to get your affairs in order." Then he handed me a piece of paper and told me to report to Fort Dix on this date. I thanked him and left. I walked out of the draft office and threw the paper in the garbage can. I knew I had to do this. There was no point in delaying it. 6 months later, I reported to boot camp. After I finished advanced individual training, I got orders to go to Vietnam. I flew out of Seattle. It was bad. One night we were on patrol and I got separated from the group. The next day, I got chewed out by my sergeant. Then the Tet Offensive happened. That's when things got serious. That's when I lost my innocence. That's when I realized that this war was real. Then one day I got orders to go back to the States. Years later, I learned that there are many ways to cope with seeing horrible things. Some people drink. The things we have seen and done during this war, the stuff that keeps us up at night. Well, that's exactly what this episode is about. So if you're scared of scary stuff, you might want to click away now. Hamburger Hill, May 1969. The order to attack came in just after dark. We formed up in a column and headed out. There were 170 of us, all infantry, all volunteers. No one was forced into the service, but how many of those men wanted to be there? Maybe a few. What were we going for? Some hill, a hill with a name, Hamburger Hill. Why do they give such names to hills anyway? God knows. But it would become infamous as the bloodiest battle of the entire Vietnam War, and I was part of it. We moved through the tall grasses and weeds of the Vietnamese countryside. It was knee-high and it scratched at our faces like 1,000 tiny knives. That was the least of our worries. Ahead of us, someone shouted "booby trap." A camouflaged tripwire stretched across the path detonated a hidden explosive, sending shrapnel screaming through the air. A medic and two others went down. Then another voice yelled, "Incoming," followed by the familiar whistle of artillery fire. We hit the deck, the grass and weeds hiding us from view. The artillery landed a few feet from where we'd been marching. Moments later, the hillside exploded again as mortar joined the chorus of incoming fire. From somewhere above us, an enemy machine gun opened fire. The bullets zipped past, too low. We could hear the tracer rounds, the ones with the red tips. They streaked through the air like angry stars. Another voice yelled, "Contact!" An M60 opened up, spraying bullets toward the tree line where the enemy lay hidden. We were pinned down. I kept my head down, my body flat on the ground, listening to the chaos all around me. It was my first time under fire. I was terrified. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to burst through my thin cotton t-shirt. I remember thinking, I'm not getting up, I'll play dead. Maybe they'll think I'm dead and leave me alone, but I knew that wasn't smart. I knew I had to move. I didn't know what to do. But suddenly adrenaline surged through me and propelled me forward. I scrambled over an anti-tank ditch and pulled myself up onto the other side. Just as I did, a bullet tore into the spot where I'd been lying just a second before. I don't remember much of the fighting that night, except for fear and confusion. Our company went after the machine gun nest. I remember carrying a wounded soldier back to the relative safety of our base camp only to come under fire again and having to book it back to the tree line, leaving the man behind. I saw incredible bravery that night, guys running across open areas, exposing themselves to bring wounded comrades back to safety. I saw terrible things too, men shot and screaming, their guts spilling out onto the ground around them. Explosions that tore limbs from bodies and sent them flying through the air like grotesque fireworks. I heard screams in the night, the wounded, the dying, the desperate pleas of men calling out for help or for their mothers. And then the quiet ones who accepted their fate without a sound, without a whimper. As dawn broke, the fighting grew even more intense. Mortar rounds landed closer and closer to our position. It felt like the hill was under siege. Suddenly, the world exploded. One of the rounds landed right next to me. I was thrown into the air and slammed to the ground. When I could hear, everything was ringing. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. Blood streamed down my face. I tasted blood in my mouth. I looked up. My helmet was gone. I felt for the wound and found a gash on the left side of my head. When the medics finally got me back to the aid station, they told me I was lucky. The piece of shrapnel had entered just above my ear and exited through my nose, taking a chunk of my face with it. But I was okay being the operative word. In the days that followed, though, the word took on a whole new meaning. We held Hamburger Hill for 2 weeks, every day the same, the enemy attacking, us defending, casualties mounting. By the time we left, the hill was littered with bodies, ours and theirs. I couldn't tell you how many men went down in those 2 weeks, maybe 200, maybe more. I do know that fewer than 100 made it back with us to base. What was it worth? I don't know. We took the hill, sure. But looking back, what was it worth? All the blood, all the death, all the shattered minds. Those who came back with us to base weren't the same ever. Again, those who had been wounded were given some time to recover before returning to their units. But most of those wounds weren't visible. They were inside, in the brain, in the heart, in the soul. Guys who had been fearless suddenly became scared, always looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows and sudden noises, unable to sleep with all the nightmares. We lost so many good men on that hill, and those who came home carried the scars, the physical ones and the invisible ones. Guys who once drank too much and partied every night now avoided crowds and loud noises, locking themselves in their rooms, drinking alone. Others couldn't lock anything out, the memories, the sights and sounds. They started saying things, hearing voices. They'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Some of them had been strong, silent types, never speaking of their feelings. Now they couldn't stop talking. They relived their experiences over and over, hoping that somehow, some way, they could make sense of them. Many years later, I sat with a friend of mine who had been in the army with me. He was telling me about his life since the war. He was married now and had kids. He talked about coaching little league and fixing up old cars. But he was different, and I could see it in his eyes. He was still haunted by things no one should ever have to witness. I asked him what he thought about the most when he closed his eyes at night. He looked at me, his eyes sad. The screaming, he said softly. The constant screaming, he stood up. I gotta go. It's late. My wife will be wondering where I am. As he walked away, I watched him and I wondered if he could ever truly outrun the ghosts of Hamburger Hill. For months afterward, I had nightmares about the hill. I dreamed of thick, tall grasses and weeds that hid things best left hidden. I dreamed of friends and comrades whose faces were twisted in their final moments, eyes wide with fear, mouths open in silent screams. Their blood painted the grass red, staining the green a deep, awful crimson. And I was always running, desperately trying to escape, always aware that something unseen was watching me from the tall grasses, waiting for me to slow, to stumble, to become prey. In my dreams, I could hear the distant, mournful notes of a bugle, the call for retreat, the call to arms, the call to charge. But the bugler was far off, playing a song that seemed to come from another world. I'd wake up choking, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. One morning I woke up and the dream was still fresh in my mind. I stared at the wall in front of me. What was it I was seeing, the wall or the hill? For a moment, I couldn't tell the difference between my waking life and my sleeping one. I couldn't tell where the tall grass began and my carpet ended. I slowly got out of bed and went to the bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. Who was that stranger staring back at me? Was I really here or was I still on that damned hill? I reached out and touched the mirror, feeling the cold glass beneath my fingertips. I was here, but only just. Months later, I read about Hamburger Hill in the newspaper. It said that more than 3,000 American troops had fought there, that nearly 700 of them had been wounded, that 34 had died. I thought about the men I'd seen die, the ones I'd carried back to safety, the ones who never made it. The article went on to say that the battle had been one of the longest and bloodiest of the entire Vietnam War. It was, they said, a victory for the United States. I wondered if they knew the cost of that victory. I wondered if they knew what we'd seen and done, the things that still haunted us, the things that kept us up at night. I wondered if anyone would ever know. In the aftermath of a fierce battle, a weary soldier finds himself amidst a scene of carnage and destruction. As he surveys the battlefield, littered with the corpses of his comrades and the enemy alike, he begins to question the very meaning of their sacrifice. He remembers the hope he felt when he enlisted, the camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers, and the dreams he had for the future. But now, standing in the ruins of a world he once knew, he realizes that war has a way of stripping away all illusions, leaving only the harsh reality of death and destruction in its wake. Why did they fight this battle only to have it end in such devastation? The names are etched into the cold stone, each representing a life that could have been. The soldier is drawn to its beauty and fragility, seeing it as a symbol of hope in the midst of despair. He realizes that even in the darkest of times, life and beauty can still be found. He hears their voices whispering in the wind, their pain and suffering echoing in his ears. The faces of the fallen, both friend and foe, are etched into his memory, a stark reminder of the lives that have been lost and the suffering that has been endured. The stench of decay lingers in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood, creating a suffocating atmosphere that weighs heavily on his soul. The initial fervor that drove him to enlist, the ideals of duty, honor, and service, now seem distant and distorted. In moments of introspection, the soldier is consumed by an overwhelming sense of dread, a premonition that his own life hangs in the balance, that his time may be running out. The ticking clock serves as a constant reminder of his mortality, driving him to confront the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. The soldier grapples with disillusionment, realizing that the grand narratives he was fed no longer hold any meaning in the face of the grim reality that surrounds him. Through the soldier's eyes, we witness the gradual erosion of his idealism and the disillusionment that sets in as he confronts the grim realities of war. The ticking clock serves as a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, forcing him to confront his own existence and the purpose of his sacrifice. He feels their presence all around him, a constant reminder of the cost of war. Every attempt at rest is marred by the grotesque imagery that haunts his subconscious. It is a stark reminder of the profound impact that conflict has on the human soul and the lasting trauma it inflicts on those who endure it. The story compels us to contemplate the true cost of war and the importance of seeking peace and understanding in a world torn apart by violence and hatred. The soldier is trapped in a living hell where the boundaries between wakefulness and sleep blur. The soldier's journey through the aftermath of the battle serves as a powerful testament to the devastating impact of war on the human psyche. His internal struggles reflect the universal search for meaning and hope in the face of unimaginable adversity. The soldier struggles to find peace in the darkness, knowing that true peace can only come when the cycle of violence is broken. He finds himself yearning for peace, longing to escape the clutches of war and to find solace in the simple pleasures of life. The soldier becomes a mere shadow of his former self, haunted by the ghosts of his experiences, forever changed by the brutality of war. The soldier takes the flower and places it behind his ear, letting its fragrance fill his senses. He knows that this moment of peace and tranquility will not last, but he cherishes it nonetheless. The soldier runs his fingers over the inscriptions, feeling the weight of their sacrifice pressing down on him. He watches as the light fades, bringing with it another day of bloodshed and violence. He knows that tomorrow he will have to pick up his weapon and fight again, but he's unsure if he can continue to do so without hope. The soldier feels a profound sadness not only for himself, but for all of humanity. He realizes that war is not just a clash of armies, but a failure of the human spirit. It is a testament to the destructive power of hatred, greed, and unchecked ambition. He wonders if those who died believed they were fighting for a greater cause, if they, too, had questions and doubts that went unanswered. He closes his eyes, trying to connect with the spirits of the fallen, hoping to find some solace in their silent company. But the silence is deafening, and he is left with a profound sense of emptiness. What was the point of it all? The soldier is overwhelmed with a profound sense of futility that permeates every aspect of his being. He looks down at his hands, noticing the blood that still stains his uniform from the fallen soldier he had tried to save. The soldier continues his journey through the battlefield, coming across a group of enemy soldiers who have also lost their lives. He sees the same fear and determination on their faces, the same innocence in their eyes that he recognizes in himself. He understands that these men were not monsters or the embodiment of evil, but simply victims of circumstance, just like him. They were forced to fight, to kill, to die, and now they lie here, wasted and forgotten, their stories and dreams cut short by the violence of war. As the soldier moves through the carnage, he begins to lose faith in the promises of his leaders. He had been told that this was a just war, that their cause was righteous and their sacrifices would not be in vain. But what does justice mean when all he sees around him is death? How can there be any meaning in the loss of so many innocent lives? The soldier feels betrayed not only by his enemies, but by the very system that sent him into this hellish landscape. He realizes that war is not a game to be won or a victory to be claimed, but a tragedy to be endured. The soldier comes across a memorial erected to honor the fallen soldiers. Amidst the ruins, the soldier discovers a single flower pushing through the debris. It is a small, delicate bloom, fragile yet resilient. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the soldier feels a deep sense of melancholy. As the darkness envelops him, the soldier is haunted by the memories of the fallen. In the quiet solitude of his tent, the soldier confronts the haunting realities of war. Sleep offers no escape. His dreams are tormented by visions of the battlefield, the clash of steel, and the agonizing cries of the wounded echoing in his nightmares. Days turn into weeks and the soldier's resolve begins to crumble under the relentless pressure of war. He questions the very purpose of his existence, asking why he is here enduring this endless cycle of violence and despair. The soldier's spirit is broken by the horrors he has witnessed and the toll it has taken on his humanity. And as the soldier walks among the ruins, he carries with him the heavy burden of his memories, knowing that the scars of war will forever remain etched upon his soul. The haunting imagery of the battlefield, the clash of steel, and the agonizing cries of the wounded create a visceral and unforgettable experience for the reader. Moreover, the soldier's premonition of his own mortality adds a sense of urgency and suspense to his internal struggles. Ultimately, the soldier's broken spirit is a tragic reflection of the larger consequences of war. Today, we remember the fallen soldiers who gave their lives during the Vietnam War. The war was a long and bloody one that lasted for many years and involved many different countries. But it was the Vietnamese people who suffered the most. They lost thousands of lives and their country was destroyed. But what do we remember about this war? What can we learn from it? In this video, we will take a look at some of the things that we must never forget about the Vietnam War. It was a war between two different ways of life. The North Vietnamese were fighting for their independence from the South Vietnamese government, which was backed by the United States. But they were now caught in the middle of a superpower struggle between the Soviet Union and China on one side and the United States and its allies on the other. The United States began to send military advisors to South Vietnam in 1955 to help them resist the communist threat. This was a war that brought out the worst in people, but it also brought out the best in others. It was a war that tested the limits of human endurance, and it was a war that ultimately could have been avoided. The war was extremely unpopular in the United States, and there were massive protests against it. Many Americans felt like they were fighting in a pointless war that was taking place thousands of miles away from the United States and had little to no bearing on American security. This marked the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a new chapter in Vietnamese history. The battle took place in 1965 and resulted in a tactical victory for the North Vietnamese. The offensive began in 1968 and involved attacks across South Vietnam. Despite the fact that the Tet Offensive was a military defeat for North Vietnam, it had a major impact on the Vietnam War. The offensive showed that the North Vietnamese were still capable of fighting and that the war was far from over. It also had a major impact on public opinion in the United States and contributed to growing opposition to the war. The war had a devastating impact on the soldiers who fought in it. Many of the soldiers were exposed to combat stress, and they experienced firsthand the horrors of war. Many of the soldiers who fought in the Vietnam War were able to develop strong bonds with their fellow soldiers. They shared a common experience that brought them together and created lasting friendships. Some of the soldiers also found purpose and meaning in their service. They believed that they were fighting for a greater good and that their service was making a difference. Veterans have sacrificed so much for us, and it is important that we remember them and honor their service. If you did, please feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or experiences. We value your input and would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again soon. We can do this by supporting organizations that help veterans and their families, by participating in Memorial Day and Veterans Day events, and by simply taking the time to thank a veteran for their service. The soldiers also had to deal with the constant threat of death, and they knew that they could be killed or wounded at any moment. There are many organizations that provide counseling, financial assistance, and other forms of support to the veterans of the Vietnam War and their families. Many come back with both. No matter what a veteran's story is, it deserves to be heard and honored. This constant threat of death had a major impact on the mental health of the soldiers. Many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a condition that can cause flashbacks, nightmares, and other symptoms long after the traumatic event has occurred. Despite the fact that the US had more troops and firepower, the North Vietnamese were able to hold their ground and inflict heavy casualties on the US. The families of the soldiers had to deal with the constant worrying and fear that their loved ones would be killed or wounded. They also had to deal with the stigma associated with the Vietnam War. as many Americans viewed the war as being a mistake and the soldiers who fought in it as being losers. This stigma often led to discrimination against the families of the soldiers, which made it difficult for them to find jobs or housing. This battle is considered to be one of the first major tests of American combat power in Vietnam, and it showed that the US would have to fight a much more difficult war than they had anticipated. The war was one of the most divisive in American history, and it had a major impact on the course of the 20th century. The Vietnam War is a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of pursuing peace and understanding rather than conflict and violence. It is a legacy that we must never forget. This resolution essentially gave the president carte blanche to escalate the war. This was a war about freedom, democracy, and self-determination. And it was a war that the North Vietnamese won. The battle was fought over a small hill that the North Vietnamese had used as a base to launch attacks on American troops. On April 1975, North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. This marked the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter in Vietnamese history. The fall of Saigon is considered to be one of the most significant events of the 20th century. The battle was extremely costly with heavy casualties on both sides. The United States eventually captured the hill, but the victory was considered to be a Pyrrhic one. The battle is now considered to be one of the most controversial of the Vietnam War. Well, the simple answer is because they were afraid of communism spreading to other countries. The war would eventually take a major turn when in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. This agreement provided for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam within 60 days and for the release of all American prisoners of war. In the early 1950s, when the war began, there was a lot of fear in America that communism was going to take over the world. They already had taken control of China and they were gaining ground in Korea, so the U.S. felt like they needed to do something to stop them. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a major turning point in the war. It was a battle between the French Union forces and the Viet Minh, a communist-led Vietnamese independence movement. The battle took place in 1954 and resulted in a decisive victory for the Viet Minh. This battle is considered to be one of the most important events in the history of modern warfare. It was the first time that a colonial power had been defeated by an indigenous force a protracted war. The battle also had a major impact on the course of the Vietnam War. It led to the withdrawal of the French from Vietnam and the temporary division of the country along the 17th parallel. Make sure to watch until the end. We've got something special planned for you, so let's get started. Thousands of people were killed on both sides and there was a lot of suffering. This was a war that was fought with determination and passion. And it was a war that had a profound impact on all who fought in it. The first thing we must remember is that the Vietnam War was not just a war between two armies. The second thing we must remember is that the Vietnam War was a very brutal and violent conflict. The third thing we must remember is that the Vietnam War was a very divisive conflict. It was a war that divided families, friends, and even nations. So why did the United States get involved in this war? At the time, Vietnam was a country that was still recovering from the effects of French colonial rule. The Vietnamese people had fought hard to win their independence in 1954. After 8 years of fighting, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with the communists controlling the north and the US-backed regime controlling the south. In 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to take all necessary measures to protect American troops in Vietnam. Over the next few years, the U.S. military presence in Vietnam grew rapidly, and by 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops fighting in the war. Despite the growing opposition to the war at home, President Johnson and then Richard Nixon escalated America's involvement in Vietnam. After the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, the North Vietnamese army invaded the South, and by 1975, They had captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. Now let's take a look at some of the key battles of the war. The Battle of the Ia Drang Valley was one of the first major battles between the United States and North Vietnamese armies. The Tet Offensive was a major military campaign launched by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong against South Vietnam and the United States. The Battle of Hamburger Hill was a battle between the United States and North Vietnamese armies in 1969. The fall of Saigon was the final major event of the Vietnam War. The legacy of the Vietnam War is a complex and controversial one. Now let's take a look at the impact the war had on the soldiers and their families. The war also had a major impact on the families of the soldiers. But despite the negative impacts of the war, there were also some positive outcomes for some of the soldiers and their families. After the war, many of the soldiers and their families were able to find support and resources to help them cope with the challenges they faced. It's important to remember that every person's experience in war is different. Some people come back with physical disabilities and others with psychological trauma. One of the most important things we can do for our veterans is to listen to their stories and show them the respect and gratitude they have earned. We hope you found this video to be informative and thought-provoking.